Chapter 24. As Will had noted to himself, Selathan had kept his party moving in the pre-dawn hours each day. They would wake hours before dawn when the Aridi escort would prepare cook fires, making coffee and toasting the flat bread over the coals. Selathan noticed that a change had come over the party of Araluans since the young ranger had left them 2 days previously. No longer did they joke and laugh around the campfire while they drank their morning coffee. They were subdued, concerned for their missing companion. It was easiest to notice with the 3 younger members, Horace, the princess, and the young ranger Gillen. Holt, of course, had always maintained an unemotional facade. He was grim-faced and taciturn most of the time. But Selathan fancied that in the past days, the grimness was accentuated a little. It was obvious that the Ranger Will provided the heart and life of the group, and the others felt his absence sorely. Not that the 2 older Rangers were any less diligent in observing their surroundings and taking covert notes as they passed landmarks. He was sure they were memorizing and noting prominent features so they could reproduce a map of the route from Al-Shabar to Mara Rock. Will might have given his oath never to reproduce the chart Selathan had given him, but the others were bound by no such promise. He was concerned about that, but decided there was little he could do to stop them. For the first few hours, in the pre-dawn dimness, they rode in their usual close-knit formation. Then, as the sun performed its spectacular arrival, the screen of cavalry around the central party moved out to take up their daylight travelling positions. On the second day, a few hours after sunup, they came upon the tracks of the party preceding them, the party who were taking Erak as a hostage to Mara Rock. Prior to that point, of course, any sign left by the riders ahead of them had been obliterated by the massive storm that had swept over the desert. Now they realized they were within 2 days of them. "They'll be moving more slowly than we are," Holt said. He knew that Selathan had sent Erak with one of the regular caravans that travelled between Al-Shabar and Mara Rock, carrying trade goods from the coast to the inland city. Such caravans already had an armed escort, and it made sense to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. But, of course, the heavily laden pack mules and freight camels would slow the party down. Gillen swung down from his saddle and knelt beside the marks in the hard ground. He made out faint impressions of hoofs here and there, all but invisible to an untrained eye. From time to time, there were more obvious clues of the party's passage, in the form of piles of dung. Gillen poked at one with a stick, breaking it up to study the moisture content inside. Rangers used such clues to determine how fresh the tracks might be. Moisture in horse dung or sap in the broken stem of a twig snapped by a passing animal. But they were unused to the blinding heat and dryness of the Aridi desert and the effect it had on moisture content. "Hard to say how old it is," he said finally. Holt shrugged. "It'd dry out a lot faster here than further north. We know it can't be more than 2 days old. It's been left there since the storm passed through." Gillen nodded. "You're right, but if I were to see that back home, I'd say it was 3 to 4 days old. It's worth knowing for future reference, I suppose." He straightened, brushing dust off his knees, and swung up into Blazer's saddle once more. He glanced towards Selathan and saw that the Wakir had stopped his horse as well and was fiddling with the ties that held his bedroll in place behind the saddle. The Aridi horse was turned at 45 degrees to the direction of travel, and Gillen had no doubt that the Aridi leader's eyes beneath the shadow of his keffiyeh were trained unwaveringly on himself and Holt. "He's watching us," he said quietly, and Holt nodded, without looking in Selathan's direction. "He always does. I think we make him nervous." "Do you think he knows we're keeping a chart of the route?" I'd bet my life on it, Holt said. Not much gets past him, and I'll bet he's racking his brains to find a way to stop us. As they moved off, Selathan seemed to finish retying the thongs. He touched his stallion with his knee, turned back to the course his outriders had set, and trotted forward. "What do you make of him?" Gillen asked. This time, Holt did look at the tall Riddy warrior before he answered. He was considering his opinion, Gillen knew, weighing up what he knew about the Wakir with what he sensed about him. Finally, Holt replied. "I like the look of him," he said. "A lot of these local officials are always on the lookout for bribes. Corruption is almost a way of life in this country, but he's not like that." "He's a soldier, not a politician," Gillen said. He had a fighting man's usual distrust of politicians and officials, preferring to deal with men who knew what it meant to fight for their lives. Such men often had an inherent honesty to them, he thought. Holt nodded. "And a good one. Look at this formation he's got us in. At first glance, it looks like we're straggling across the desert like Brown's cows. But we can't be approached from any direction without these outriders spotting something." "His men seem to respect him," Gillen said. "He doesn't have to shout and bluster to get things done." "Yes, I've hardly heard him raise his voice since we've been on the march. That's usually a sign that the men believe he knows what he's about." They fell silent for a few minutes, both studying the white-cloaked, straight-backed figure riding on his own, 20 meters ahead of them. "Not too friendly, though," Gillen said, grinning. He was trying to keep Holt talking in an attempt to keep his old teacher from worrying too much about Will, gone somewhere into the unknown wastes of this desert. Holt sensed his intention and appreciated it. Talking with Gillen gave him some moments of respite from the constant nagging worry he felt about the boy who had come to mean so much to him. Without intending to, he let out a deep sigh. Gillen looked quickly at him. "He's all right, Holt," he said. "I hope so. I just think—" Whatever it was that Holt thought was lost as something drew his attention. There was a cloud of dust moving towards them from the front, one of the outriders, he realized, as he managed to see more clearly through the heat shimmer and make out the dark figure at the head of the dust cloud, and could see the individual puffs of dust kicked up with each stride of his horse's legs. "What do we have here?" he said quietly. He touched Abelard with his knee and moved up to ride beside Selathan, Gillen following a meter or so behind him. "Messenger?" he asked. Selathan shook his head. "It's one of the screen. They must have seen something up ahead," he told them. The rider was closer now, and they could make out detail. He swerved his horse slightly as he made out the tall figure of the Wakir and rode directly towards him. "Vultures," said Gillen suddenly. While the others had been intent on the rider approaching, his keen eyes had sought ahead of them. Gillen looked up now, but Gillen's eyes were younger than his. He thought that perhaps he could see black specks circling high in the sky ahead of them. Or it could just be his mind telling him he could see them now that Gillen had said they were there. Any doubt was removed when the rider came closer, reining in his horse in a sliding cloud of dust. "Excellence, we've seen vultures ahead," he reported. Selathan waited. His men were well trained, and he knew there would be more to report. "I've sent Corporal Iqbal and 2 men ahead to reconnoitre," the men continued. "In the meantime, I've halted the forward screen." Selathan nodded acknowledgement. "Good. We'll continue until we come up with the screen. By then, Iqbal might have something to report. Return to your post," he added. The messenger wheeled his horse, touching brow and mouth in a hasty salute, then clattered away back the way he had come, raising more of the fine dust. Selathan glanced at the 2 rangers. Better safe than sorry. Those vultures mean there's something dead up ahead. There's no knowing if whatever it was that killed them is still around. Holt nodded agreement. It made sense. The desert was a dangerous place to travel, he realized. Selathan was too good a soldier to go blundering in unprepared to see what had attracted the vultures. There's a lot of them, Gillen pointed out. That could mean there's been a lot of killing. That's what I'm afraid of, Selathan replied. His fears were well founded. They came up to the scene of the battle an hour later. Not that it had been much of a battle, it was more of a massacre. Horse, mules, camels, and men were scattered about the desert, lifeless shapes surrounded by darkening patches of dried blood that had soaked into the sand. It was the trading party from Al-Shabaab, and they had been wiped out to a man. As the new arrivals cantered in among them, the heavy black vultures left their feasting and flapped lazily into the air. Holt motioned for Evelyn and Horace to wait behind. He and Gillen dismounted and walked among the bodies with Selathan. The men and animals had been killed and then hacked in a senseless frenzy. There was barely a body with just a single killing wound. The freight packs had been ripped open and their contents scattered on the ground. Anything of value had been taken. Then the predators had done their awful work. When, do you think? Holt asked. Selathan looked around, his normally impassive face dark with rage and frustration. Earlier this morning, I'd say, he replied, and Gillen, kneeling beside one of the bodies, nodded confirmation to Holt. The big predators, the cats and jackals, haven't got to them yet, Selathan explained. They tend to prowl at night, so it must have been after dawn today, and the vultures are still gathering. Holt had walked away as Selathan was talking, studying the scene more closely. Selathan glanced up at the slowly wheeling black birds above them, riding effortlessly on the currents of heated air that rose from the desert floor. Any idea who might have done it? Gillen asked, and Selathan studied him for a moment, regaining control of his emotions. The Tuolagi, he said briefly, almost spitting the word out. All this, he indicated the hacked bodies, is typical of their handiwork. He shook his head, puzzled. But why? Why would they attack a well-armed party? There were over 20 soldiers in the escort. Usually, the Tuolagi prey on small parties. Why this? Maybe someone paid them, said Holt, as he returned from his survey of the desolate scene. The Wakir looked at him now, frowning. Who'd pay them? He challenged. Whoever betrayed Erak in the first place, Holt told him. Take a look around. There's no sign of him. Whoever killed your men took him away with them.